Hey guys, CJ here, and in this video I'll be showing you how you can change the chain and sprockets on your bike. I'll try and list every tool you'll need down in the description below. It is worth saying that I did use a lot of different tools. I actually had to borrow a couple of extra ones from a mate, so just bear that one in mind before you start this job. First, we need to make sure the bike is on its centre stand or a paddock stand if you don't have one. Then we need to remove the chain guard, which just needs a cross-headed screwdriver and a 5mm Allen key. Next we need the 4mm Allen key to remove the engine sprocket outer cover. You may also want to disconnect the front left fairing, just so that you've got a bit more access to some of the parts you need to remove. If you do this, don't forget to disconnect the left indicator. We now need the 8mm socket to remove the 3 regulator rectifier bracket bolts. You'll then need the 10mm spanner to remove the gear shift link arm. Next we need to remove the speed sensor using the 4mm socket, followed by the engine sprocket cover.
And that will just sag like a wizard's sleeve.
To save completely removing the cover, it's probably worth just hooking it out of the way using a bungee cord or some string. So it's at this point where you're definitely going to want to have some gloves on if you haven't got any already. As you can see, it is absolutely filthy in there. All that gunk is just built up from the road, all from the oil, just general road dirt. You're going to need somebody to press on the rear brake before you remove the speed sensor rotor. Once you start to remove this bolt, it's just going to spin the rear wheel. Now we can actually remove the speed sensor rotor. So at this point, removing this front bolt is incredibly hard. It's one of the tightest ones on the whole bike. So the easiest thing to do is going to be to actually take the bike off its centre stand or a paddock stand, physically sit on the bike with the front and the rear brake held down, and then get somebody else to try and remove this whilst you're sat on it. So that was an absolute pain in the arse to get off, and we actually needed to use an impact gun in the end just to loosen that bolt that tiny bit. If you haven't got one of these, it's going to be quite hard, but I'm sure it can be done about it. So it is worth noting at this point that it is going to be really tight the whole way along, so don't worry if you feel like it's not getting any looser, just keep on going with it. It's now started to just get that a little bit looser. There we go. Now we need to loosen up the rear axle nut. Now we can loosen the chain adjuster bolts at the back using the 5mm Allen key. So as you're loosening off the bolts, just hit the back wheel, hit it forwards. We're just trying to get all this slack into the chain. You can see now that we've got a load of slack just here.
We've got the guide for the pin that we're going to put in sort of the main
the main threaded part, if you like, of the breaker. We know that that's the right size compared to these other ones. We know it's the right size because the pin we're going to use to break the link actually fits through that part right there. So that's how the tool will look when we're breaking the chain. We can tighten up the little holder for it. Then this is the bit that we're going to be tightening up to actually push the link out of the chain. Just until we feel a little bit of resistance. There we go. And we have a handle for extra leverage.
So now we want to place the chain breaker tool over the chain. We'll start by positioning it at the back of the chain. You'll feel one of the rivets just go into place. We can then start pushing the front of it into the rivet in an attempt to push it out. Now that we've got the chain breaker in place, we're going to want to get a socket or something else just to give an extra bit of leverage onto this point here.
So we can wind this tool back out again. And actually this is the link that's come out.
Done. So now the chain has been broken, we can now just remove it from the back. So now the chain and the sprocket nut have both been removed, the front sprocket will just come off. So now we're going to start to remove the rear wheel so we can remove the rear sprocket. Ooh. We're now going to remove the rear axle. You probably can do this on your own, but you might find it easier if somebody else supports the rear wheel as you're pushing it through.
Now and that'll just roll out. You can just let the caliper slacken.
Now is probably a good time to remove some of that dirt from around the inside here. Once you've removed the wheel, just make sure you're careful with the spacers. There is one on each side and they're both different. So this one is just got a little bit of a rim on it. It's more like a hat sort of shape. And this side, again, you can just see it's a bit thicker. It's just got less of a lip. It is just a spacer. So at this point you can actually remove the whole sprocket unit from the wheel if you want to work on it. So you literally just lift it up and it slides right off. Once you've taken the sprocket unit off, you can actually now inspect the wheel dampers. If you've got any cracks or anything like that in these, because they're rubber, then they probably need to be replaced. Now we can loosen the bolts and remove the sprocket from the carrier itself. So I'm just going to give the sprocket carrier a quick clean with some WD-40. So just looking at the old and the new sprockets, the old one actually has a rubber dampener on it. They don't actually need that anymore, it's just something that was used before, just as a way to make the bike a bit quieter. But manufacturers basically realised that it doesn't really make any difference and it's not worth the hassle of putting it on there. So the new sprocket comes without. In terms of the wear, you can probably just about see on this one where it's just starting to curve to the front, it's just starting to spur off just from the way the chain spins around on the bike, whereas this one it is perfectly straight out. With the rear sprocket there's not as much wear on them. It's just one of those things where if you're replacing the front one you might as well replace the back one. And the idea nowadays is that you do it all as a kit, so chain and sprockets, you do it all at once. So it is worth putting some WD-40 on the edge of the bolts. It's just good maintenance. And now we can start installing these back into the housing. When you're installing the bolts, it's worth noting that they only go in one way. There's a flat edge on them, so just make sure that is on the outside as you're putting them back in from the bottom. We now want to put the sprocket carrier back onto the wheel before tightening the nuts to the 60 Newton meters that's required. Okay, now we can install the rear wheel. So now that everything is back on, we're just going to do the exact same steps but in reverse. When you're installing the front sprocket, again just make sure that the writing is on the outside. So before we install the bolt for the front sprocket, if you notice here we've just got this orange residue on there. Now this is a Loctite material, but we want to clean it off and then put some fresh stuff on if you've got it. If you don't, it's not the end of the world, but in an ideal situation you would put this stuff back onto it. So this is something that's just interesting and something that's worth noting. Where my bike has a Scott oiler, I've not actually got any seized up links, so mine's actually very nice still. It's in fairly good condition, it's just worn, that's the only reason I'm changing it. So the O-rings between the links, quite often they will actually seize up and go to solid, quite rigid, and they crack, whereas you can see from my one here they're actually still quite spongy. It's still a good rubber feel to it, and that's just because my Scott oiler keeps the chain lubricated, keeps it moist the whole time. So now it's worth laying the two chains out next to each other just so you can check the length of the new one to make sure it's okay. So as you can see from my one, it's pretty much perfect. We've got a little bit of space at the end here just where we're going to add on the spare link. We can now start lining up the chain. Okay, around there. Yep. All good. All new chains should come with some chain grease, which will go over the rivet link just to make sure it's lubed up. Ideally you just want to cover the whole thing in grease. So again, just make sure you've got the writing on the outside for the final link.
So we're going to use this plate that comes as part of the chain breaker / riveting tool to push the plate of the chain onto the pins which are attached to the plate of the other side. We just want to locate this plate first. See where the rivets have come out a little bit now, ever so slightly. This is what determines how tight this link is, so we can't overdo it and we can't underdo it. If we overdo it, it'll be too tight. The gaps between the two are still looking, healthy. As long as if these feel flush, do they feel flush to you? If you sort of run your fingers down there, would you say that they feel flush?
Now that we've pushed the plate onto the pins, we're now going to rivet them to hold it in place. So now that the chain's all connected up, we just need to get the slack sorted. We do this by making sure there's no more than 20 to 30 mil of slack going up and down here. To do that, we need to just tighten these chain adjuster bolts at the back. We need to make sure it's the exact same on both sides. So there's markers on here. We just need to make sure the little indent is the exact same on this side as it is on the other side. To start with, you'll probably need to physically pull the wheel all the way back just to start feeling getting a bit tighter on the chain. And then we're going to use these chain adjuster bolts to really start to get the 20 to 30 mil under control. So once you're happy with the chain, we'll then need to grab our torque wrench, set it to 100 Newton meters and tighten the rear axle nut. We can now tighten the engine sprocket nut to 115 Newton meters. Again, you want somebody on the back brake so that the nut doesn't spin as you're tightening. Sounds good. We can now put the speed sensor rotor back in its place as well. Before installing the engine sprocket cover, if you've cleaned off all of this grease, it's worth reapplying it to the clutch push rod. We can now install the engine sprocket inner cover. When you're lining up the cover, just be sure to keep the speed sensor outside of it. We can now tighten the speed sensor mounting bolt to 6.5 Newton meters. We can now install the gear shift lever, and we need to ensure it lines up with the gear shift shaft using the pen line that we put on earlier. And now we know that the gear shifter has got the exact amount of preload. This just ensures that the gear lever is in the correct position. And now we can tighten the bolt. We can now install the 3 bolts for the regulator rectifier bracket. We can now install the engine sprocket outer cover. And finally, we can install the chain guard followed by the front fairing, and make sure you don't forget to reconnect the left indicator. I hope you enjoyed this video. It'd be great if you could give it a thumbs up if you did. Comment down below on anything else you'd like to see and I'll be sure to give that a go. Thanks very much for watching and I'll see you next time.